All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 9 of Diaries of an Indie Game Dev. This episode was inspired by some recent commentary from some of our patrons in relation to an upcoming Mondays in mmorpg episode for the podcast that I'm going to record. But the question that was asked was basically, why is there such a fan aversion to crowdfunded games? Why are so many people against crowdfunded games? I'm going to take a look at not the same topic per se, but we are going to talk about crowdfunded games in general, why we did not choose a crowdfunded option for our game, why we potentially could do some crowdfunding in the future, why many other games do crowdfunding, and what are some of the pitfalls of crowdfunding, and basically the reasons why we chose not to do it. So, I want to save some of the juicier aspects of this for the podcast, but one of the things I can say is that if you look at the statistics for the vast majority of Kickstarter funded games, and we're talking games in general, not just MMORPGs, the failure rate for games is well below, and I mean well below, the traditional failure rate for any other type of projects. For example, if you're looking at a traditional business where it is investor funded, or funded by the owners of the company, or they went out and got a loan. These are other ways to create something. The statistics, and I'm going to be putting all of these statistics, by the way, are in the Patreon post associated with this video. So if you're interested in that kind of information, check the link below because that's where you're going to find all this stuff. But the traditional rates of failure for businesses are significantly higher than they are for kickstarted campaigns, kickstarted games. And again, we're not talking specifically MMORPGs, we're talking games in general, and there are lots of different types of video games. The vast majority, and we're talking 90% here, 90%-ish of games that are funded on Kickstarter are successfully funded and go on to reach completion. It is a single percentile digit. There's other data to look at, but overall, there is a single percentile of games that fail to deliver on what they said they were going to do. That is an extremely small number when we're talking about overall games. So, why did we not crowdfund our game? Why didn't we do what all of these other companies did? If you look at, for example, Shroud of the Avatar, even though Pantheon failed, Pantheon did an initial Kickstarter. You have games like the Pillars of Eternity games. These are just a couple of examples. The Bard's Tale. There have been quite a few games crowdfunded by industry veterans, and there have been a lot of projects that were funded based on just independent teams who had an idea. The easiest example I can give you is that when we first started going into this was right when the Pantheon Kickstarter had failed miserably. And by that point, there had been a couple of other projects that had seen some significant negativity surrounding them. And they had industry veterans at the helm. So one of those was, I believe the pronunciation was Goddess or Godis, which was Peter Molyneux, if I remember his name correctly, who's the guy behind the Fable series. His project actually was successfully funded, and then, I think it was, again, for the sake of this video, I'm not actually fact checking right now. This will be in the associated post with this. It was a 2 or 3 year span after they were successfully Kickstarted, and they basically came out and said, we're out of money, nothing we can do about it. These things happen. We couldn't have foreseen these things. And I immediately said that I don't think that that's the case. if you're an industry veteran of any industry, I don't care what you're talking about, um, as a project manager, you have the ability to draw upon your years of experience and estimate timelines within a reasonable fraction of a degree. Um, Drawing upon my previous experience in construction, running a small business there, we always would add anywhere from 15 to 25% extra onto the end of whatever we thought was going to be our actual complete time, depending on the complexity of the project. So, if it was something where it was going to be in the middle of summer, so it's prime time, not a remodel, brand new construction, in and out, we might tack on 15%. But then if we're talking, well, here's a remodel on a 75-year-old building, we don't know what we're going to be getting into when we start ripping up floorboards and stuff. We don't know if we're going to have to replace the subflooring. We don't know if there's termite damage, water damage, so on and so forth. We don't know if the house is settled. Um, these kind of things will add 25% onto it so that we have plenty of extra time to get the project completed. Same thing if we know that we're doing a project in the winter months, you're going to want to tack on that 25% just by default, because during the winter months, you never know how the weather's going to act. So, if there's going to be weather delays, you need to have those factored into the project. So these are some things where, as an industry veteran, you should have the capability to estimate a project to a successful completion point, even allowing for up to a 25% um, leeway in terms of scheduling. So I don't buy it when industry veterans come out and say, 2, 3 years after a project has been successfully funded, that, well, unfortunately, folks, we've spent all the money and we're not going to be able to release the product because we couldn't anticipate timelines. That's If that actually is the case, those people have no right to be in a project management position because they don't know what they're doing. Any project manager worth their salt in any industry can reliably estimate a project. That's their job. That's what they're there for. And if you can't do that, then you're in the wrong career. So we took a look at that, and then we also took a look at all of these independent projects. And the big thing we saw on the independent side was you've got all of these people who have great ideas, but none of them have any business experience. And if you look at the vast majority of these Kickstarter projects where they're asking for whatever, it doesn't really matter the sum of money. We're gonna not talk about AAA or veteran Kickstarters for the moment. We're gonna talk about the independent Kickstarters. But if you look at those projects across the board and you look at their pie charts of where they estimate the money is going, it's all tied into salaries for people, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But what none of these people factor in, at least what I've seen, even, we're in 2019 now, and I haven't seen this change at all. A big issue, and we're not talking failed projects at the moment, we're just talking an issue with independently funded mmorpgs, who then come out a year later or two later and say they need more money because it's unexpected costs, unexpected this, unexpected that. Let's talk about that for a minute. And I've briefly touched on this in, I think, a couple of previous episodes, but I want to dive deeper into it in this episode. So the number one thing that most projects lack when they get going is any sort of actual project manager who knows what they're doing. They also lack any business experience. So a lot of these independent projects are coming in and they have this amazing idea. They might even have a fairly accurate timeline for the creation of the art and the content for the game, but they typically don't factor in all of the associated business costs and business development time, as well as things like, are we going to be remote? Do we need a studio? Are our people willing to work for pennies? There was a really interesting, I think it was, what is it called? Kotaku? I always forget the pronunciation of that website. They were talking about what is the average salary for an independent game developer, and it's around 50,000 for teams. And if you are an individual, this is the fun one. If you're an individual working by yourself on a project, the annual salary is less than $12,000. Those are facts. The average salary for an independent developer working by him or herself on a project is less than 12 grand. And for people who are working on a team, it's 50. Now, here's big issue number one. People get money and they suddenly think that they need to be paying themselves a $100,000 salary. As a general rule, when you start talking to investors, they're going to be asking questions like, well, are any of the staff getting paid, or any of the founders getting paid? And while it's not necessarily a bad thing that founders are making money, $100,000 is a ridiculous amount of money, and no startup founder should be making that kind of cash. $50,000 is the max that anyone should be drawing as a salary while the product is being built. $100,000 salaries are only justified after a product is launched and it's proven that it's an actual viable product that's going to sell copies and be a commercial success. So until that happens, no one should be drawing any sort of salaries above $50,000. And that's one of the number one rookie mistakes a lot of the crowdfunded projects make, is as soon as they get cash into their bank accounts, they're immediately turning around and drawing these big fat paychecks and going, woohoo, I'm going to be a full-time game developer. And 18 months later, they're like, oh my God, we've run out of money. Like this is not good. And the reason they've run out of money is because they didn't have any actual financial foresight. So business planning, business management, financial planning, these are all very, very important aspects of being a successfully crowdfunded project. And when you start looking across the board, whether or not any of these games have yet to release, keeping in mind that the statistic likelihood of failure for Kickstarter projects is extremely low. But even that being said, there's still a lot of projects which have yet to reach completion yet. So they were funded maybe 2014, 2013, whatever, or 6 years later, 7 years later, and they still haven't seen the light of day. That causes some people to question whether or not these companies are actually producing anything. And in many cases, what it comes down to is just a lack of understanding on the part of the people on the outside knowing what it actually takes to create a game. So we actually discussed this briefly, and I'm going to touch on it very briefly, because we were talking about it with our patrons the other day in Discord, which is the vast majority of people don't really understand how long it takes to create an MMORPG. And with a traditional AAA company, you're only being a witness to the last 2 to 3 years of development of that project at most. So you're missing the first 2 years of, say, design time, the first couple of years of prototyping, the alpha, beta, all this stuff, which adds up to 6-ish years of time minimum. So it's 6 to 8 years for completion. Most people don't understand that. So when they see these Kickstarter projects taking 6 years or 7 years, they start to get antsy and think that these projects are failing. And there are all of these negative connotations that come with being a crowdfunded MMORPG. So when we looked at that across the board, might have to move that a little bit. When we looked at that across the board, we said, well, we don't want to be associated with any of that negativity. We want to be able to come in with a fresh slate and make a mark for ourselves without having any of this baggage that comes along with being a crowdfunded project. Now, technically, we were a crowdfunded project the first 3 years of operations, but we didn't do things through a crowdfunded website. Now, I know some people will say, but you had an Indiegogo. So again, to refresh everyone's memory, back around late 2014, before we had a website, before we had a legal entity, before we had the LLC set up, and etc., we had friends and family who had gotten wind of what we were working on and said, hey, we would like to support you. We would like to throw money at you. And we sat down and said, man, it would be great to have some money thrown at us because we could use that money to pay for the legal costs of forming up this company, help us pay for assets and business stuff and servers and websites and all this other stuff. So we should do that, but there was no legal way for us to accept money from people if we wanted it to be considered tax deductible and used for the cost of game development, unless we set something up through a crowdfunded platform. So we chose an open-ended Indiegogo campaign where we put an arbitrary number, I think it was like $5,000 or something, um, as the goal, but then we had it as I think it's called a flexible campaign, which means just whatever comes in is what we'll take, and we'll just use that to help us with the cost of on continuing to create the company. That was by no means a actual crowdfunding campaign. We didn't go out there and heavily promote it. We didn't spend any money on advertising. It was just like, here's this thing, put it out on our social media channels, let our friends and family know, and we let it go from there. And I think we raised a few $1,000s. I really don't remember the amount. 3,500 maybe. It wasn't a lot, It was the first initial friends and family people. These were also the same people who, we had before we even did that, we had sold, I don't know, like 4 or 5 different types of T-shirts, and we were using the funding from the T-shirts to help pay for assets and business costs. So those are the same people who at the very beginning were buying T-shirts were also the same people who bought into that early Indiegogo. But we never actively, we didn't go out there with the intent to create a $1.5 million Indiegogo or Kickstarter and try to build a game from that. Now, the other reason we chose not to do any sort of crowdfunding in a traditional manner was because we knew from the get-go that we wouldn't be able to raise enough money through crowdfunding to realistically have a successful campaign. And what I mean by that is, in order to if you look at most of these games, most of these MMORPGs, they've asked for anywhere from 1.5 to say $3 million off the top of my head. They're not asking for 50,000, 25,000. They're asking for, millions. And most of these that is successfully funded are getting a couple $1,000,000 or $3 million based on the fact that they have veteran people on their staff who have a certain celebrity status associated with them that allows those campaigns to draw that kind of interest because there are a previously built up fan base ready and waiting for those people. We do not have that. And when we looked at that, it was like, well, we're going to have to build our fan base from scratch. So if we go to Kickstarter and ask for $2 million to create an MMORPG, we're going to get laughed at because we don't have any experience. We've never done this before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, So we just said, you know what, we're just going to go do it on our own. We're going to do everything from scratch. We're going to bypass crowdfunding. We're going to bypass Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and we're going to go straight to having a pre-order store on our website and just directly selling to the consumer. Now, that was a calculated decision on my end after having all these years spent working in the travel space as an influencer and as an author and as a marketing manager for a lot of these campaigns that we've worked on. I was always doing self-published books and or projects where everything was run in-house. And the benefit to that is that you don't have to share money with anybody. There's no third parties that are taking a cut. Now the flip side is you have to work a lot harder on the marketing side of things because there's not Kickstarter, for example, has a built-in audience in the sense that if you put your campaign on there and it does reasonably well within the first like 48 to 72 hours, it will automatically get bumped up and be promoted as this, hot project of the week or whatever. And that'll give you some inherent built-in visibility. Whereas if you're doing it all on your own, you don't have that, so you have to work twice as hard. Flip side is you work twice as hard, but you get to keep all the money, as opposed to projects like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, these other places where they're taking a cut. It might not sound like a big cut, but every single percent adds up when you start talking about tens of thousands of sales, especially if you're talking hundreds of thousands of sales. There's a really good article on this recently. There was an independent company who decided that they were going to do an Epic exclusive on Epic's launcher. They were going to bypass Steam and go straight to the Epic launcher instead. Outcry from Steam lovers, and the company came out with a press release and says, look, we get what you guys want, but at the same time, we have to look at it from a numbers perspective. And, the fact that we can sell an extra, getting an extra, I forget what the percentage off the top of my head was, is a single percentile number. But that single percent, when I say single, I don't mean one, I mean single digit percent of additional revenue and sales and stuff that they were going to get through the Epic Store. And I'm botching that because it's not a single percent difference in sales. It is like a 10% difference or something. Anyway, the amount of money that they were going to make by going to the Epic stores as an exclusive as opposed to on the Steam platform, it was basically $9 million. So for a small independent company like that, $9 million is very literally everyone's salaries for about 3 years. So that's paying their entire staff for 3 years just because they're working with this other platform where they're going to sell fewer copies, but they're going to retain a larger percentage of the profits. So when you start looking at it that way, it can make sense to do Kickstarter and Indiegogo and places like this, but you are going to be sharing additional revenue with these websites. And if you're a small team where that extra $75,000 could pay someone's salary for the whole year, that's literally someone's salary for the whole year. So these are the kind of things that you have to think about when you're deciding whether or not to go with a traditional crowdfunded campaign. I don't think that any of these campaigns where they are promoting, I just saw one today actually, it's for some cyberpunk game. It's a VR experience and it's like a 7-man team. Excuse me, and they're on there asking for like $25,000. And I just think that's you're blowing smoke up people's hoo-haws with those kind of numbers, because in no way, shape, or form are those realistic numbers. You can also look at like smaller campaigns, like Project Gorgon did a Kickstarter campaign, raised a few tens of thousands of dollars, and then a year later turned around and did a smaller Indiegogo campaign. I think combined, both those campaigns were still under $100,000 combined. If you're going to do a project like an MMORPG, $100,000 is nothing. It's not. It's 2 people's salaries for the year. And if you want, this goes back to my earlier episode where we were talking about, the cost of AAA engineers and AAA talent. These people are going to cost you $120,000 to $150,000 a year. You might need a couple of those people on staff to help, kind of compensate for your lack of talent, so to speak. But you can't have an entire team made up of that if you expect to get anything done for a reasonable amount of money. When you're a small company, maybe you've got $2 or $3 million at your disposal. That money needs to go as long as it can and as far as it can. And it's not going to go very far if you've got 10 people on staff drawing $150,000 a year. Your money's going to be gone in a year. So it's important to be frugal and to understand that money goes quick. It goes a lot quicker than it comes in. So, talking these little $25,000 to $50,000 Kickstarters, they're not going to do anything. I think anybody who buys into those types of campaigns is buying into a pipe dream, because that amount of money is not going to allow these teams to do anything realistic with it. It's, that's enough money. Let's assume they raise $50,000. That's one person's salary for the whole year. And if they've got 7, 8 people on staff, Well, how are the other 7 people getting paid? Where's that money coming from? Where is this 75, $75,000 gonna go? What's it realistically going to do? Um, Now, let's talk a little bit about, would we ever do, now that we're farther along in our project, I've talked about why we didn't do a Kickstarter in the beginning. Would we still consider a Kickstarter in the future? I think I took a yawn and a drink of coffee. I'm recording this at like 2:30 in the afternoon. It's my nap time, so I want to wrap this up and I'll take a nap. Um, if we were to ever do a Kickstarter in the future, it would not be for game development funding. Um, I would want to go to Kickstarter with a beta product, something it's already done with alpha, it's in beta, and as opposed to needing money for the actual development of the game, it would be funding used for polish, bonus features, and marketing. So if we were to ever to do something like that, it would purely be for a marketing campaign. And the success or failure of that Kickstarter campaign would in no way, shape, or form impact the actual launch of our product. So we would need to be at a point where it's in beta, we have an actual launch date in mind and set, so that we could go to Kickstarter and say, hey folks, here's the past 5, 6 years of our development. Here's all the documentation. Here's the five, we've done, I don't know, 500 and some videos at this point. We've done, I think I just did episode 508 of the newsletter this morning. I think, yeah, I did that this morning. So, by the time we got to that, maybe we'd be 700 in, something like that. But we would easily be able to point back to 5, 6 years of development, building up to a certain point, showing we've already been through pre-alpha, we've already gone through alpha, we've already done this, and this. Here's all of our milestones. Here's all of the everything you need to know. Here's the game. It's in beta. You can play it now. Um, all you need is to pick up a copy of the game, and you're in. And maybe even make the beta at that point, open beta, to where people can come in and maybe have test weekends, where it's like, here for the, these 72 hours, you can get in and test the game for free, um, see what you like, and if you like it, back us on Kickstarter. Um, I could see that being something that could potentially work for us. Um, we would not do a small $50,000 campaign, though. We would probably do something like a $250,000 campaign, where we would be looking at bringing on a couple of employees and then whatever's left of that. A couple of employees to handle all of the bonus material that we would add to the game with the Kickstarter, and then whatever's left over would be for marketing costs. So we would, if we were to do something like that, it would be done as a marketing campaign, as a marketing Kickstarter, as opposed to a Kickstarter for development of the actual product. If I had to go back and do this all over again, I still wouldn't do a Kickstarter project. I wouldn't do it. Um, I think that for me, there's, but again, I'm not a veteran of the industry, so this is me. If I had to go back and do it all over again, exactly the same way, I wouldn't change the way we did things, because by doing it all ourselves and having our own pre-order store, sure, our numbers were smaller than what they could have been had we done a huge campaign, but at the same time, we've gotten to keep all of that money for ourselves. I mean, the only money we've lost out on is the money that is the cost of doing business. Um, a few percentile points off the top for the cost of PayPal fees and transactions, and some legal stuff. So at the end of the day, we've been able to retain you know the vast majority of our money for us, as opposed to sharing it with third parties. And to me, having that creative control is more important than anything else. I got to get used to this new webcam position too, because I keep looking up and watching myself on the OBS screen instead of looking at the camera. It's probably better next time if I just shut that down so I'm not looking at it and actually paying attention to the camera. So I apologize if I'm constantly looking up there and it's as opposed to looking at the camera. Anyway, I wouldn't do anything different. I wouldn't do a Kickstarter campaign unless I knew that we had the industry veterans on board to make it worthwhile to say, let's do a $1.5 million campaign. If it was something like that where we could actually come in and justify it and say, here's this really cool idea we've got for a game. Here's the prototype that we've been working on for the last 18 months. What do you think, etc. Let's go. But I would need to know, that it's worth it. And I would also have those timelines ironed out in stone. Those would not be flexible timelines. Those would be mandatory. We would, but again, that's me as a project manager coming into this with my 20 some years of experience as a project manager and saying, I know how to keep projects on task. This one's been a little different for us because we were doing it all as newbies. So there's been some flexibility because we're not industry veterans. So remember what I talked about in the very beginning of this episode. I said industry veterans who are project managers should be able to, with 95% accuracy, estimate how long and how much a project is going to cost, as opposed to us being complete newbies. We've had to redo things a few times, and it's taken us a little bit longer than we anticipated as a result of us being new to this. But if I were to do this for a future project, I would be in a better position to estimate timelines because we would know how long it took us to do this, and then I would be able to look at that and go, well, this time around we've actually got this many team members, we're fully funded, we're going to be able to do it in this amount of time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The big thing to understand, and this will be in an upcoming episode of the Mondays in mmorpg podcast when I cover this topic, but it's the whole concept of what people think goes into crowdfunding games is completely different than what actually goes into crowdfunded games, because people don't understand timelines. They don't understand the actual 18 months to 2 years of design time that goes on. It could be shorter than that, but a year and a half, 2 years of design time that goes into a project before you ever even start on the prototype. Concepting, doing game design documents, an overview document of your entire project, figuring out what you're going to build for the prototype, etc. And then it's another year and a half to 2 years to build the prototype. There's 3 to 4 years that go into a project before it's ever even ready to get to the point where you would want to put it up on Kickstarter. And that's, again, this is another issue where so many people just get an idea and they're like, oh, I'm going to do some really cool concept art and stick that up on Kickstarter, and that's going to be enough to, get our project off the ground. And that's not true. You got to have more than an idea to get a Kickstarter project off the ground. You definitely need more than an idea to convince investors and publishers. You need something concrete. You can't just walk into a pitch meeting with a sketch of ideas and some concept art and say, give me $5 million to make this game. You've actually got to have put in the time and effort and have some actual track record behind you to show that you're worth that kind of investment. So there's it's just a tricky slope, the crowdfunding plateau. Like I said, if we decide to do it again in the future, not again, but if we decide to do it in the future, it would be for marketing, not for actual development of the project. We would have timelines in place, and we certainly wouldn't do it for less than $250,000. Which by that point, if we're already at a point where we're getting ready to launch, even if the campaign fails, you're still going to generate a lot of publicity from that campaign who are going to be people that either pre-order the game for launch or try it out once it's launched. So you're still going to be getting the same effect, because whether or not they purchased it through the Kickstarter as part of that marketing campaign, or they purchase it once the game's gone live, you're still getting those customers one way or the other. So it's just a marketing ploy at that point. Um, Food for thought. I think Kickstarter is great for small projects, but even these single player titles, you can look at like Pillars of Eternity was still a game that took, a few $1 million to complete, and that's a single player game. So even those games, are taking a team of, say, I don't know how many people they had in their team, 10 people, probably more. And I know Obsidian put some of their own money into the project as well. So, you can figure, at least $3 to $6 million conservatively to put together a project like that. Um, it's not chump change. I think people sometimes forget how much labor goes into making an MMORPG, because it's not something that just 5 or 6 people can do. Um, I mean, 3 or 4 people can work on a project, and it can be a hobby project. You can look at a game like Project Gorgon. Um, hubby wife team with some artists here and there, but it's a hobby project. It's not. I don't. I could This could come back to bite me in the butt to say this, but I don't foresee that ever being something that's going to be an actual commercially. I gotta figure out how to phrase that. Um, I don't see that as ever being a commercially successful project. I think it's always going to be just a small hobby project that draws maybe a few thousand subscribers, a few thousand players, but it's never going to have any sort of economic impact, if that makes sense. If you want your game to have 50,000 players or beyond, there needs to be a team there, and that requires a lot of hard work, a lot of passion. It requires money. That money's got to come from somewhere, or the people behind the project need to be able to be willing to work for free for X amount of years until the project launches, like we have been. But even we only did that to a point, and then started bringing in investment money, because that was what needed to happen for the project to expand in scope, and be able to do all the things that we wanted to do for the launch product. Um, there's a lot of moving parts. Crowdfunding is only going to get you part of the way. I don't see it as ever being a viable product or viable financial means. I don't think there's, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't even think there's been to date, I don't think any of the MMORPG or video game projects that have been successfully funded through Kickstarter, I don't think any of them have only relied upon the Kickstarter funding to complete. I think a lot of them had studios behind them that put some of their own money in, whether it was for the prototype or for some stuff after the fact. Or you've got a lot of companies that go on to do additional private crowdfunding, like what we've done, through their own websites after the project left Kickstarter. Good examples of this being like Shred of the Avatar and Star Citizen, with Star Citizen being the star project of that, in the sense that it's gone on to do $250 million beyond what the original Kickstarter was for. So yeah. Anyway, those are some insights into crowdfunding, why we didn't do crowdfunding, why we wouldn't do it differently, etc. Don't forget to stick around for the next episode of Mondays in MMORPGs coming up tomorrow, which is going to be covering this topic of crowdfunding, but from a different angle. We're going to be talking about, why are people so bitter about crowdfunded projects, and why, what are the illusions, what are these misunderstandings that are going on. So we're going to dive into crowdfunding in even greater detail in the next episode of the podcast. To tune in for that tomorrow. Don't forget to please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification button to let us know that you're going to get notifications when they go live, and share this out to your networks, please. I would love to get to 100 subscribers and be able to customize the URL and then go beyond that. This is all new stuff for me. Like I said, this is only episode 9. The upcoming episode of the podcast is going to be episode 3 of the podcast. I'm going to be streaming regularly starting in early September when I get back from France. We're going to be streaming Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturday nights from 8 p.m. onwards as we dive into World of Warcraft Classic. Also, up in November, I'll be streaming Jedi Fallen Order. Next year, I'll be streaming Cyberpunk 2077. But I'm starting to get into this full time now, doing content creation and streaming. So if you like what you hear, do me a favor, subscribe, share, let your friends know, get more people to subscribe. And if you want to help out financially, the Patreon is all linked below. You can go over there. There's a lot of different tiers you can sign up for. Obviously, the blog post associated with this is part of one of the tiers. Thanks so much to our supporters who have been following along for the past few months. And I look forward to seeing you guys in tomorrow's episode of the podcast and the next episode of the Diary of an Indie Game Dev, which will be coming 2 weeks from now. So until next time, Scape Gaming, folks.